This is going to be a really important conversation over here at Humant on Monday morning. I'm pleased to introduce everybody to Rebecca Ingber, who we don't think that we're related, but it turns out that we both have mothers who 100% of the time call us in very inopportune moments. So in that sense, maybe we are related, Rebecca. But Rebecca is an expert in international and national security law. She is a professor at Cardozo University. From 2021 to 2023, she was the counselor on international law at the Department of State. She has also testified to House and Senate committees on executive power and war powers. Of course, we're going to be talking about the double tap strike from the early moments of the boat bombings that we now know have occurred for, I guess it's been months. And to just bring us to speed here, let's remember that in this particular strike, this is one strike after the first strike, where the New York Times reported that that boat had turned around. In this strike, there were mixed messages. Trump said that the vessel was headed to the United States. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that it was probably headed to Trinidad or the Caribbean. CNN recently reported that it was about to move to a larger vessel in Suriname. And then, about a month and a half after this strike, which we, of course, have learned killed all people on board, Trump posted on Truth Social that two survivors were found in a different strike. They were rescued and they were repatriated for, quote, detention and prosecution in Ecuador and Colombia. So we're speaking specifically about this strike where everybody was killed and more than one strike was ordered. So welcome, Rebecca. I appreciate you coming in. And I mean, you're coming in and that you're sitting in your home right now. But can you start by giving us a legal framework here and explaining why this double tap order would be so problematic?
So, thanks so much for having me on, Sasha, and also for the shout out to my mom who called just as this was starting, which, hence that explanation. So, first of all, the president has been engaging in multiple strikes since September. So there have been, I think, almost 24 strikes that have killed over 80 people since that first strike on September 2nd. And the administration has been trying to paint these in a wartime lens. So they're trying to say, they've said all sorts of things. And some of what we know about their legal position has been reported about what's in this secret OLC memo, this classified OLC memo that
Office of Legal Counsel for
Yes,
everybody
thank you.
paying attention inside the Justice Department. Mhm.
Right. So, so what we do know from the reports to Congress and from what they've said publicly is that they consider the transport of drugs to the United States as somehow an armed attack on the United States. They're claiming that there are various organizations that engaged in drug smuggling who are themselves what we would call in the law of war space organized armed groups. Of course, an organized armed group is a real term of art. It means basically a group that has military capabilities and military command structure and looks very much like a state armed force. So they're claiming that these organizations that they're not going to name for us have been involved in armed conflicts with the United States that we didn't know about until now, and that therefore, due to that and the argument that the smuggling of drugs is itself an armed attack, the combination of these things, they're arguing, gives the president the right to use force against anyone that he claims is even just affiliated, or the boats carrying drugs that are somehow affiliated with these groups. And so one of the things that we don't know is whether these strikes are whether the legal theory is that the strikes are happening on the drug vessels themselves, where the individuals on the boats are themselves collateral damage, or if they're actually making an argument that the individuals on these boats are themselves somehow combatants or civilians directly participating in hostilities, all of which, again, relies on a theory that transporting drugs is itself military hostilities, right? And so all of this is relying on some manufactured facts about what these organizations are doing and what the people on them are doing, and some very, very twisted legal theories about sort of importing from the global war on terror, to use a term that's outdated, space, importing those concepts where there were actual armed attacks happening into the sort of criminal enterprise space where we're talking about drug smuggling. So that's the legal theory generally for the campaign as a whole, all of which, frankly, is illegal. And the reason the president wants to call this an armed conflict is because killing people, killing mere criminal suspects, the premeditated killing of criminal suspects outside of an armed conflict is something else entirely. And we have a simple word for that. It's murder. So, okay, so then what makes this this double tap, this second strike different? And legally, given that all of this is murder, it's not all that different. I think the reason it's breaking through, I think it is broken through to the public, it's breaking through on the Hill, is in part because people are having a visceral reaction to it, right? The idea of these men clinging to debris. We no longer are conjuring up the images that the president wants us to conjure up, that these are like hardened narco terrorists, to use their language, right? But rather helpless people clinging to debris after being, struck from the sky by the U.S. military on a fishing boat, right? And so there's that reason. But I think there's also a different reason, which is related to the law, which is that even if all of that stuff I said was true, even if you could make that convoluted legal argument that we're in an armed conflict, that these groups have attacked us, that these individuals are directly participating in hostilities in some way, even if you could do all of that, it is still, under the law of armed conflict, absolutely prohibited to target and kill people who are what we call hors de combat, right? Outside of combat, incapacitated in some way. And so while that's sometimes difficult to sort of parse, like, is this person truly hors de combat? Someone who's shipwrecked, that's a paradigmatic example. That is a textbook case that could have been a PowerPoint in any ops law course given to soldiers in basic training.
So, okay, so we'll come back to shipwreck and this idea of what is a shipwreck. And by the way, as a person who doesn't have a legal background, I'm going to ask you a bunch of pretty dumbed down questions here, and you're going to really need to dumb it down for me so that I can make sure I'm following it. But it's when you talk about whether this is a war and the justification for this, which is still quite unclear, I think it's important to note that a conservative writer in the Washington Post wrote just about 5 days ago, George Will, quote, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth seems to be a war criminal without a war, an interesting achievement in terms of treating them as enemy combatants and the implications of that. I'm trying to understand, like, so much here. I mean, when we think about the way that previous administrations went after terrorists in the Middle East, they might have struck those terrorists once and injured them and then finished them off. When this administration has designated drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, and then he's alleging that these drug boats are carrying drugs to the United States, of course, none of which we can confirm, but does that give him certain abilities based on what we're talking about?
Right. So there's a lot packed in there. One thing that I want to, well, first, let's just talk about the facts, right? Even if you didn't care at all about the legality of these questions and only cared about the policy, and I'll say I think there is good reason to care about the legality, even if you are not a lawyer and you don't care about law for law's sake. I think that we might ask ourselves, well, what kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a society that is governed by some kind of neutral principles where we know when we can be killed or not by our leaders, right? Just full stop. Or do we want to live in a place where, depending on who we voted for president, and if they're our guy or not our guy, we might be targeted and killed for mere criminal acts? I mean, we don't even have the death penalty in this country for drug smuggling. So the idea that we've gone so far from deciding as a country that that's not a crime to which we're going to set the penalty as death, to, oh, by the way, let's get rid of trial altogether, and let's just let the president kill them on his say-so. I think that's a pretty steep fall for us as Americans. So that's just a little plug for the law. But on the policy side, we don't have any information that the president has provided about exactly who these people are. What we do have is a lot of evidence that they were going in a totally different direction. And we also have a lot of evidence that there is not fentanyl on these boats, as was originally claimed, right? That in fact, most of these vessels are, if they're carrying any drugs at all, are carrying cocaine. And third, these are, I don't see any evidence, and even an allegation by the administration that the people on these boats are themselves somehow members of what the administration is characterizing as criminal gangs. That instead these are most likely, to the extent they're carrying drugs at all, most likely to be fishermen who were paid to do a one-off task, and were looking for extra cash, right? And so we would not characterize, even if these groups themselves were ISIS, Al Qaeda, right? People who are paid to smuggle drugs for Al Qaeda, in a one-off task, are not themselves directly participating in hostilities. They're not themselves combatants. So does that? I feel like there were other pieces of your question that I'm missing, that I'm forgetting.
I mean, I do think that understanding the comparison of why is it okay to kill what you consider to be a foreign terrorist in this way versus the drug boats is kind of where we're centered for the
Right.
moment.
I just remembered you asked me about the foreign terrorist organization designation. So that one's really important because I think it fuzzes things up a lot for people. So what is a foreign terrorist organization? What is that designation? Congress has legislated that the Secretary of State can designate organizations, and he has, at this point, total discretion to designate anyone, right, as a foreign terrorist organization. And that carries with it certain criminal penalties, right, certain financial penalties. It does not, under any circumstances, under any theory of law, create targeting authority for these groups. Congress has said this repeatedly. The administration has at various points acknowledged it. But they are throwing that in the mix, I think, because rhetorically it fuzzes things up for people. And what does it mean to be designated as an FTO? It just means the Secretary of State said it, right? And so
But
it's
then
not.
doesn't it also allow the president to authorize covert action? I mean, there's like
No.
Title 10 authorities and
That is separate authority, right? And
Mhm.
so we might get into questions about whether or not the that raises questions of what the president can do outside of, for example, a specific congressional authorization to use force. It doesn't mean that the president can murder, and it doesn't really have anything to do with FTOs. So FTO designation does not provide targeting authority under any circumstances. And the administration has come up with this separate title, designated terrorist organizations, which is entirely manufactured. They're drawing on the language of FTOs. They are claiming that by saying something is a designated terrorist organization, and several of the organizations that they've reportedly designated are made up entirely, right? So the idea that they can take a name, make up a designation, claim that some group that may or may not even exist as a group is that thing, and suddenly the president can kill people. That's a stretch for me. And even if you like the idea of the president getting aggressive on drug smuggling, which I think many people can get on board with, I think we should all be concerned about the idea that the president can just kill anybody. Now, what sets that apart from Al Qaeda? Let's be clear. 9/11 was an actual armed attack on the United States. We had the most significant attack on the United States on the homeland since Pearl Harbor. This was a real armed attack, right? And even then, it was unusual for the United States to say, we're going to treat this as a war instead of terrorism, instead of how normally we treated terrorism, which was through criminal process, right? And the reason for that is because there was no, at least the argument, right, is that there was no other way to address the threat that was coming from Al Qaeda because they were located in Afghanistan. They were located in other countries. In this case, very simple way to address the threat of these boats that the president himself said he could interdict, but instead chose to strike them, right? And in this case, we have no armed attack on the United States.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a huge difference. And then, even then, we had a congressionally authorized use of force, right? Congress just 7 days after 9/11. So the idea that Congress, would never have time to do this if, and therefore we can't wait for Congress. Congress authorized the president to use force on September 18th,
Yeah.
2011, 7 days later.
Yeah. Right. 2001, I think, not 2011.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah.
Yeah.
But okay, I appreciate you walking through some of this. And before we move into Congress and the role that it's playing right now, let's just talk about the number of strikes that this boat ended up receiving. Uh, because it also has now been reported that there were four strikes. Are there more legal ramifications when we get past the double tap to a quadruple tap?
Yeah, so this is still the first strike, right? So this is September 2nd, when presumably the administration is going to trot out and try out its theory that it's been talking about internally for a long time, we now know. Um, and based on the, various reports, including that OLC had started work on this memo over the summer, the Office of the Legal Counsel at the Justice Department. So they take that first strike, and you'd think that this is going to be a moment where, in particular, you'd think the Secretary of Defense would be very keen to watch that entire strike play out. And in fact, afterward, he bragged about having been in the room to watch it play out. Um, and that's important just because, as we now know, he's trying to sort of throw the people under him under the bus a little bit by claiming that even though he has their back, he has no idea what happened after he left the room for some important meeting. So the so what is the relevance of the later strikes? Well, one piece of relevance that I think might be important to people who want to see accountability for these strikes is that even if this OLC memo, this DOJ memo, um, I should say there's for those who are not aware, there's this sort of discussion out there in the legal world about the extent to which an OLC memo provides immunity, quote unquote immunity, for any acts that it covers. So if people are acting in reliance on this legal advice that they got, does that mean they will never be prosecuted? Now, legal advice does not provide per se immunity, but it makes a future prosecution extremely unlikely. And part of that is something I think we could all understand, that it would be sort of unfair to hold people accountable for something that might seem complicated
Mhm.
legally, right? When they've gotten advice from the people they view to be the experts on this, right?
So yeah, and I'm going to jump in just a second here, but please finish this thought. Yeah.
Yeah. So if the legal memo um, tries to justify and says that all of these strikes are authorized, presumably it's going to use language like um, if they are in line with the law of armed conflict. That's pretty standard language that these memoranda, even when they are justifying the overall use of force, would use. And certainly they're relying on a theory that it is in line with the law of armed conflict in order to say that it's not murder. And so even under that scenario where we are at war, uh, again, killing the helpless, killing the incapacitated, killing a prisoner of war, right? Everyone, knows that from the movies. You can't kill a prisoner of war. That's a war crime. And so too would be if we were in an armed conflict, killing a person who was shipwrecked.
So I think, can we talk for a moment about the secrecy behind who some of these groups are that get targeted, and then if you could explain how this administration has been making up group names. That's not actually something that I know about, and I'm seeing that in the comments that people have also been wondering about that.
Yeah, I mean, one that I've seen is, and I'm sorry, I apologize because I don't speak Spanish, so I'm going to butcher this, but cartel de las soles. So that's just a turn of phrase. It's a characterization that people in Latin America use for corrupt leadership when they are basically saying that those individuals are in the pockets of drug dealers and stuff. So it's just a term of art. It's sort of like a glib characterization that people use for their leadership when they're trying to say they're corrupt. It's not an organization. It's certainly not a terrorist organization.
Hmm.
That's one
Okay.
example.
Okay. And then in terms of the secrecy behind this legal memo, I mean, if the idea is that we are at war and we need to take certain actions, I mean, there's some justification in a situation like that to keep certain information classified. But there seems to be so much secrecy here. Uh, is that essentially to enable this administration to carry out these strikes without scrutiny, because Congress is also trying to understand what the legal justification is.
Yeah, so I actually think that there has not been. I think there's been, in some respects, more transparency than you got certainly in the early days after 9/11, when if you'll recall, um, over the course of the last 25 years, presidents through multiple parties have made pretty aggressive claims to act in wartime. And sometimes they've been pushed out back upon, and sometimes the dust has settled and those claims have ultimately been entrenched. And so, for example, the torture program in the years after 9/11, it took years for the public to even become aware that that was going on, that the black sites were happening. These were black sites. The idea was that they were entirely shrouded in secrecy. Here, we have, in just a matter of months, radical transparency into the fact that the president is killing people at sea who have not engaged in an armed attack on the United States. And so we
I mean, we
don't
literally
really.
had the president himself post on Truth Social, not only notification, but even short videos, very short burst black and white videos of the boats as they're moving through the water. So
Right.
that's true.
So we don't yet have the video, right, of the second strike, and we don't yet have the OLC memo. But the thing about these OLC memos when they're classified, and
And for
every
people just joining, she's referring to the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department, which is setting the legal justification for the boat strikes. Please go on, Rebecca.
Yeah, so it's not in any way unusual for the president to refuse to release, at least in the outset, an OLC memorandum, a legal justification for their actions, and so this is no different in that respect. And there are many good reasons why it might take some time for the memo to come out, because usually they are relying heavily in this context. They are relying heavily on classified information, and I'm reminded of the Awolaki memo that in which the Obama administration targeted and killed an American citizen abroad. So that's a pretty, significant act. And the legal justification was very, very slow to come out. It came out kind of piecemeal. And eventually that OLC memorandum is in the public domain with the classified information redacted only because of litigation.
Mhm.
And so in this case, we may well have the same situation. And the problem, in my view, with not releasing these memoranda is that they're twofold. One, the administration, if they have a good legal justification, loses the opportunity to really put it out there. They also may seem to be overclaiming. So in the years, I think, in which we didn't have the full legal analysis after the Awolaki killing, many in the public thought he was killed for being a propagandist. And not for being an actual combatant who was, the equivalent of a combatant, an unprivileged belligerent who was himself directing operations, right?
For Al
And
Qaeda,
so
for
for Al Qaeda,
everybody. Yeah.
for Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula at the time, right? And so whatever your views are on the legal justification, and I think that's a really fraught one. Um, Whatever one's views are, it is a big difference to target and kill someone for being an operational leader of an organization and for being a mere propagandist. And so I think it was really important for the administration to get out the legal arguments simply to cabinet, right, to constrain what people thought they were trying to claim. In this case, I don't think there's going to be some brilliant analysis in that legal memo because we know what they're doing. And we know, they've made many claims. They've made claims to Congress. They've made claims publicly about with all sorts of legal justifications, and none of them hold water. There is no legal justification that the administration can make for um, killing people for mere crimes.
Hmm.
Who are not engaged in an armed attack on the United States, who are not themselves directly participating in hostilities. And so the fact that we've got this classified memo out there, I think, just fogs it up for people. They think that, oh, if only we got that memo, then we would understand, and then we'd see that this was all legal. And I think that's the real problem, is that it leaves us with this sort of veil, as if there's a real legal theory there.
I mean, the question of the legality of this comes in the context of U.S. lawmakers telling members of the military don't follow orders that are unconstitutional. Of course, we saw Trump's fiery response to that. But when the double tap order came in a report from the Washington Post, this bothered some Republican lawmakers. For example, Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, who chairs the Senate Armed Services Committee. Both that committee and the House equivalent have vowed to investigate this to get answers on exactly what happened. As a legal expert, what should they be looking at?
So, what I would want to know is what orders were actually given, who was in the room, what were there were these contingency plans that were discussed ahead of time, and so that Hegseth would have signed off on, which is basically like another set of orders, right? Explaining, okay, if this happens, then do this. I would want to see those as well. And again, this is critically important because not only should Congress investigate to sort of air this for the public, and I think that's the most important thing, that the public have full information about this, because ultimately, real accountability for this kind of act comes through public opinion. But in addition to that, people could be prosecuted for these acts. People who fall within the UCMJ, could be court-martialed, and and Hegseth himself could be prosecuted again, especially if what happened falls outside of that
So,
OLC, that legal advice.
So what we now have seen as this has evolved is that Navy Admiral Frank Bradley has said, yes, it was my order. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that he wasn't around to watch the live video before the order was given and only found out about this hours later. But right after the strike happened, he told Fox News, quote, "We knew exactly who was in the boat. We knew exactly what they were doing, and we knew exactly who they represented, and that was Trinidad Aragua." Is Hegseth ultimately still liable when, as you say, Congress, especially these committees, will be looking at who gave the orders, and we've seen Hegseth's role kind of evolve itself?
Yeah, I mean, and there's two different things going on. One is, have the individuals committed a crime, right? Have they committed murder? And the other is, will they be prosecuted for it? So all of these strikes are murder, full stop, sadly. Um, and giving the order to kill these individuals, um, that is murder. Giving the order to strike the boat, knowing that the individuals will be killed, that is murder. These boats could have been interdicted in the normal course. The cocaine shipments could have been sunk, and the people could have been captured and prosecuted if we actually had evidence.
And
That
as
they
I
were engaged
mentioned at
in
the
crimes.
beginning of this, that was what happened in a following strike, that people did survive and they were captured, which is, I think,
And
even
they
more
were.
interesting to note considering this September strike.
It's really interesting. It's interesting both because because it suggests that there was a potential change in protocol, and that there may have been real concerns inside after that first boat strike. The second thing that is really interesting about it is the fact that they were not brought back to the United States for prosecution. They were not held as unprivileged belligerents. They weren't, under a law of war framework,
They
which
went back to Colombia and to Ecuador.
either of which, right, either prosecution or law of war detention is what you would expect if it were in fact true that we had all this evidence suggesting that these people were engaged in hostilities against the United States.
So, okay, I know that we're just like ticking through different things here, and not everything is being like fully tied up in a bowl for us. And so our listeners have to understand that these are open ended questions that are ongoing. But I want to read something that the Wall Street Journal reported a few days ago. One of them was Alex Ward, a great reporter who I know personally. Quote, "Before making the decision to fire that Navy Admiral, Bradley told lawmakers he'd asked his legal advisor to provide him the definition of a shipwreck." Remember, I'd asked you, let's talk about what it means to be shipwrecked. "Seeking to determine whether the damaged vessel was off limits to attack under the law of war. Deciding it wasn't, he proceeded with the deadly second strike. An American aircraft fired 3 precision Griffin missiles at the vessel and killed the 2 survivors. The close up video shows the partially clothed men being blown apart in the water. So, why is his legal advisor saying this isn't a shipwreck? And explain to us why that matters here.
I don't know why they're saying that this is not a shipwreck. And one of the other pieces is it doesn't have to be a shipwreck for them to be hors de combat, right? For them to be incapacitated. But for them to be incapacitated, meaning unable to continue fighting, they have to have been fighting in the first place. And so that's part of what perhaps makes this so hard to parse for these people who have already decided, the JAG and the people who were giving the orders, Bradley, the people who are acting at the operational level, they are being put in an impossible situation in a way, right? Because they've got this legal guidance from DOJ, and they've got manufactured facts from the White House claiming that these groups have engaged in an armed attack against us. Which I've seen some people saying, what are your sources? Well, this isn't. I'm trying not to write a law review article here with citing everything that I say along the way. But some of this is self-evident, people. Have we, experienced 9/11 from these attacks? I know that that drugs kill people. First of all, these are not the same drugs that you're concerned about. We can be concerned about cocaine, but it is not fentanyl. Um, I also know that there are a lot of things that kill people that are not an armed attack. Um, and so uh, so that's, just to put that aside for the moment. But in terms of why they gave this advice, they're being given the legal theory somehow that transporting drugs is itself participation in hostilities. That is an absolute grotesquerie of the law, right? Given that theory, the next step is, okay, well, are they continuing to engage in transporting drugs? I guess. I'm guessing. So the idea that they are waving for help, which I think under any circumstances would be clearly a clear signal that they are not that they're not participating in hostilities. In this twisted theory, if they could be waving for help to help collect the drugs, I guess that's the idea that they are not incapacitated from doing the thing that they are claiming is hostilities in the first place. But again,
Right.
it to
And
me
I think
links there. Yeah.
well, what I was going to say is that Republicans like Senator Tom Cotton, who chairs the Senate Intel Committee, has said that these 2 people are considered targets because if they're waving, they could also be radioing for help to continue the drug trafficking. So that's why they still posed a danger. Does that carry any water, with no pun intended?
Yeah, well, I mean that's also that raises a really interesting tension, which is that the argument here is that they still posed a danger to, and the danger would have to be to the soldiers, right? So the idea is that um the person who is reaching, even if they're wounded, they're reaching for their weapon, they pick up their weapon, they're wounded, but they might be continuing to shoot you. Well, of course, that's a different scenario, right? Here, they never posed a threat to the people that were targeting them. And in fact, that is the government's argument for why these strikes do not fall within the War Powers Resolution, which would require that even if they were authorized in the first place, they would have to cease after 60 days until Congress authorized them. Um, the argument there is these aren't hostilities, even though we're blowing up boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. These aren't hostilities because there's no risk of return fire. There's no risk of an
But
exchange of
if
fire.
the drugs are able to be distributed, if they continue through the path which this administration argued was ultimately meant for the US, without knowing what that vessel contained, I'm wondering if that's where, for them, the danger lies.
Again, if that's the danger, right? If drug smuggling is, instead of just a crime, if that's war,
Mhm.
then I guess that's uh, then that might be the argument. But the obvious thing to do in that scenario still would be to capture the individuals just like they did the second time around, and then sink the boat. And again, they've told us that they had the capacity to do that. They told us we could have interdicted this vessel, but instead we chose to blow it up. And that is the, interdiction and normal law enforcement and prosecuting these individuals are the standard way the government has dealt with this in forever. Now, I see a lot of people suggesting that this suggests a lack of concern for the just drug smuggling generally, and I want to say that I absolutely think this is an incredibly critical issue that the administration and Congress should work together on. And this is working at cross purposes. These boat strikes are working at cross purposes with actually addressing the policy issue. And one example of that is that other countries that have always engaged in intelligence sharing with us on drug interdiction are now refusing to share that intelligence because these strikes are unlawful and because they cannot participate in extrajudicial killings alongside the
Are
United
you
States.
talking about a country like Colombia? Could you just
No,
share a
I'm
little?
talking about the UK and Canada.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Um, well, another aspect of this that I thought is notable is the fact that the leader of U.S. Southern Command uh, is retiring unexpectedly before his term is up, Admiral Alvin Halsey. And this was happening amid these boat strikes. And so that also raised a question before we even learned about this double tap of whether or not the two were linked.
Yeah, we didn't know why exactly at the time, and I have no inside information on this, but I do wonder if there were concerns specifically about that second strike. I mean, for people in the military, I think the second strike is all the more um, sort of devastating because, like I said before, it is such a classic textbook example of something that's not lawful. And so it may well be that people raise concerns after that first strike and that those concerns perhaps were dismissed or perhaps not. They may have changed the protocol because we did see that that they took different action the next time there were survivors. But in any event, it may well be what led to his retirement. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this has brought up so many questions for so many of us. And then on top of it, we saw the president pardon the former president of Honduras who had spent decades in prison for cocaine trafficking. So there are just so many areas where I feel like what is the strategy here?
I think that's
Um,
another great example, right? We supposedly care so much about this, but we're simultaneously pardoning someone convicted of doing the very thing that we're saying is an armed attack on the United States. So I don't see, sometimes the law and the policy, it feels like they are parting ways. Sometimes it feels like the thing that would be the best thing to do for policy reasons isn't something that you can find a way to make work legally. And that is, and that's a real, that poses real complications for people inside the executive branch and for executive branch lawyers as they try to find a way to navigate this to get the policymakers to find a lawful way for them to do something. Here we have the policy and the law. Um, the illegality of these acts links up with the fact that these acts are not actually good policy. They're not helping the people they're trying to help. They're hurting the people they're trying to help. They're not actually solving the drug crisis. And simultaneously, we see the administration taking actions that will only further the problem rather than trying to help it. This piece of it is outside of my expertise, but as I've been delving into the topic more regularly because of my legal expertise, I have been learning so much about this. And so, I defer to others who have real policy understanding, but this is what I have learned at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't be able to say how we can stop the drug crisis in the United States, but my sense is that it's a multifaceted approach, which wouldn't just involve national security, but also providing resources to people in communities, which could also include mental health support. Again, also not an expert in that area. So let's just kind of turn the clock forward. What does it look like moving forward when it comes to other movements that we've seen with this administration? The trend is the administration does X, a lower court's like, no, we're gonna say we're gonna stop that. There's like a federal judge who gets involved, or you know, it gets held up, ultimately gets bumped up to the Supreme Court. And most of the time, the Supreme Court, in the majority, allows this administration to go forth. Is this ultimately going to end up in the hands of the Supreme Court justices?
So, in order for a use of force issue to end up in the Supreme Court, typically it's pretty hard for these issues to end up there. There needs to be some kind of jurisdictional hook to get it into court and someone with standing. And often, the main way that use of force questions end up in the court is through detention. And so, had one of those individuals that they captured, the survivors that they captured, had they detained them inside the United States, or possibly, or in a place where the writ of habeas corpus ran,
Wait,
then
wait, okay, okay. I heard a little bit of Latin, and I told you you got to dumb this down
sorry.
for me. So do that.
So so um
Yeah.
so courts don't have jurisdiction over people being held in France, for example, people being held by the French government in France. Courts don't have jurisdiction, and historically, courts have not have held jurisdiction over military detainees held abroad. But after after 9/11, when presidents of multiple parties held people at Guantanamo, these were legacy cases from the immediate post 9/11 years. The case went up to the Supreme Court to determine whether or not they had a right to bring their case to court, right? To just ask the government to prove why it should be, to show cause why they should be detained. And the Supreme Court granted that to detainees who were held at Guantanamo because it was essentially de facto U.S. territory for all intents and purposes. Because
So there needs to be a U.S. Territory element involved for this to
perhaps
end up. Mhm.
it is
Okay.
possible that someone held on a Navy ship. I don't think I think that would be a novel question. And so I was wondering, if they continue to hold them on the Navy ship, if we might see a lawsuit. And my guess is that they were also wondering that, which is why we saw such a very quick disposition of those cases, handing them back over, repatriating them home, because the government didn't want to have to end up in court over this. They didn't want to have to prove their case in court.
Hmm. Interesting. But there are these two survivors now. Could these survivors file a lawsuit against the Trump administration from their countries?
It's possible. It would be hard to do, but it's possible. Yeah.
And
So
it would
so
require resources that someone who could theoretically be a low-level drug trafficker might not necessarily have.
Right. There could be ways that these issues end up in court. And the clearest path would be through detention. Um, and so, and of course, also a prosecution it could end up, that would be well into the future. Obviously, this administration's not prosecuting anyone.
Mhm. Okay. Very interesting to understand the ramifications of that. Um, I mean, you've been following this very closely. As a journalist, this has been a new territory for me to cover. And I remember in the pandemic trying to talk about like the competition and power between like the COVID race in the vaccine development in Russia and China. And I had no idea what experts to go to because it was like I needed an expertise that almost didn't exist quite yet. So, what has it been like for you looking at this every day, considering what you've previously examined?
So I first started talking about this. I'm a law professor. I teach international. I teach constitutional law. I teach national security law, seminar on war. And so I first started talking about, and I don't tend to talk to the press. I don't tend to do these kinds of things. Um, and the reason I started talking about it is because I was worried that the legal arguments were not out there and that people were misunderstanding, because it is complicated, and there is a sort of small cadre of people who have worked on these issues inside the government, who all see exactly what is happening here, and all of us, I think, have felt compelled to speak up about this because this is a somewhat limited expertise. There isn't a lot of private practice that involves talking about when states can use force and when we're in an armed conflict with a non-state actor, who is an unprivileged belligerent, et cetera. And so I felt compelled to talk about it for that reason, and it kind of spiraled. And so at this point, especially after this second strike news, it has been sort of a constant barrage of questions about it. And I mean, I'm dreaming about this stuff. It's like haunting my nightmares. So it has been kind of all encompassing, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. And a comment from one of our viewers, Ron, is correct. There has been a lawsuit filed. The family of a Colombian man who was killed in a strike has filed what appears to be the first complaint against this. There's already a
Is that the one in
process
the
at play.
Inter-American Commission? Yeah.
That's right.
So we'll
Yeah.
see. Right.
Yeah.
So that would be an opportunity to air the facts. It wouldn't necessarily have any sort of enforcement power.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. But it could lead to more facts, more
Yes.
cases, and
Yeah.
that
I mean,
could
there's
lead to.
a
Mhm.
lot of the purpose of these lawsuits is just kind of almost like a truth and reconciliation process, right? I mean, just getting the facts out there for the public, having some sort of neutral decision makers look at the information, request more information, put the facts out there for the public. I think that's all a really important part of any litigation, whether it be before an international body or a domestic body.
Do you think that this situation has ramifications that go beyond the situation itself, drug trafficking? You know, you had talked about how the UK, for example, is pulling back some of its intelligence. What are the effects that this has on the US's standing in the world, in your view?
Well, so this is not so other states, there's all sorts of ways in which international law gets enforced. It is not like private law where the cops show up. Countries have to consent to the rules that they're bound by, and enforcement takes all sorts of different forms. It doesn't always go to a court of law, but one of the ways that enforcement happens is through other states complaining, other states raising issues with the state and deciding that they're not going to participate in the illegal acts, or there might be other repercussions. And so we're just beginning to see what the repercussions are going to look like. But there's no question that our standing in the world has been severely diminished. And this is one part of that. And all of, to the extent that we care about our national security, which I deeply do, and spent most of my career inside the government working on these issues, right? So this is not, I'm not coming at this from someone who isn't concerned about these issues. And as someone who cares deeply about, just generally the lives of Americans, right? Like I devoted much of my career to this. So I want the U.S. government to be engaged in policies that will actually help rather than hurt, not sort of, war cosplay, but rather actual efforts to make the world a better place, frankly, and make our lives better. So it concerns me that they're using sort of a pretextual basis to blow up some boats, and in the process hindering our actual ability to address the problem through intelligence from our allies, through um, the states themselves, from where these people are coming from, working together with us. We're not even apparently striking boats that are filled with fentanyl, right? Apparently, the boats, to the extent they have drugs at all, are shipping cocaine to other countries. So there's a lot. There's a lot that concerns me here. And I'm also concerned that, God forbid, we had a real immediate um, national security crisis on our hands. I don't see this administration as prepared to handle that. And that gives me great pause.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of Trump critics who would be in that same boat with you. Um, Absolutely. What lesson should future administrations and the Pentagon, what should they take away from this incident? Because right now, we don't know if there will be repercussions for this administration. Right here today, Monday, December 8th, 2025. A year from now, a few years from now, if Democrats win the House, for example, maybe that'll be different. But answer it for today.
So one of the things that I'm concerned about is that the last 25 years, how have the last 25 years of the post 9/11 years led to this point? I think rhetorically, at least politically, the public has become inured to the idea of targeting bad guys from the sky, just killing people if they pose, if the president says that they're bad, and that's not the legal theory that past administrations have operated under. There was an actual armed attack, there was a congressional authorization to go to war, and there was real, genuine work done to determine um, who were belligerents in those conflicts and who were not. But there were also many, many, many missteps along the way. And I have personally been a critic along the way, both inside the government and outside the government, where I felt like the government was overreaching. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us going forward, especially national security professionals and national security lawyers, um, to think in the future about how to place better guardrails around the use of force, legal guardrails and policy guardrails, how to actually educate people, so the public, so that people understand what the legal theories are and what the policy theories are, and what are the red lines, like where are we not saying we can use force, for example. Um, and I
Yeah,
think
but hold on that point. How I mean, I don't expect Americans to understand the nuances of Chinese intelligence services exploiting American industrial innovation, because they have to live their own lives. Like, they have to put food on the table, they're raising kids. So why does the burden ultimately fall on them?
no, the burden falls on the administration to make its claim. I mean, yes, I also care very, very much that there are people who are concerned with the climate and public health and all of these things that I don't have expertise in, and I'm glad they're covering it. But I also do follow it as an American, as a citizen. It's my civic duty to follow it to some degree, and we all, have an obligation to vote. And so I do think that, given that public outrage is the primary source of accountability for violations of public law, um, I do think it's incumbent upon administrations to explain why they're not just making an argument that they can kill bad guys.
Mhm.
Just at a simple level. If people feel like this is just more of the same, then that's a real problem in terms of communication about what has come before.
It's interesting because it makes me remember Duterte, who led the Philippines during a time where drugs and gangs were rampant. And there were some who I even spoke to here in the US who were celebrating the fact that he engaged in these extrajudicial killings because they just felt like it was making their country safer. But the question of at what cost? The other point I wanted to make a distinction on was that it's different when it's on land versus on water. Can you just break that down for us? Why this distinction exists and what it ultimately means?
Yeah, the distinction between so the primary legal distinction here is that when you're taking strikes on land, there is that other country, right, at issue that you are using force against. So if the United States were to take force, to use force on Mexican territory, if the United States were to use force on Venezuelan territory, for example, that would directly implicate the UN Charter. The UN Charter prohibits the use of force against other states. This is in some ways the backbone of the entire international world order, that we're not allowed to use force as a tool of policy against other states. We can't just use force um, because we want their resources. We can't just use force because we don't like what they're doing, right? We can only use force in very, very narrow circumstances. And those specifically are when the UN Security Council authorizes it, or when we're acting in self-defense against an armed attack. So if we were to use force on another state's territory, um, without having been the victim of an armed attack, if it wasn't in response to an armed attack trying to repel that armed attack, we would ourselves be engaging in an armed attack on them. And that would, give them, as the victim of that armed attack, the right, the authority to use force in self-defense in response.
And when we're talking about, international waters, if although I don't know the precise locations of many of these strikes, none of us do. We're talking about off of Venezuela and in the Caribbean region.
If they are in the territorial waters, right outside the state itself, then that's considered to be the state. If they are in international waters, as the administration is claiming, then it's not a strike on the state itself. And so it
Mhm.
doesn't directly implicate the charter in that way.
Hmm. Well, I want to give you a chance to say your last thoughts here. I appreciate the fact that we've been able to have this conversation. It's certainly a complicated conversation. There's just no two ways around it.
Yeah, and I think we covered a lot, so I don't have a lot to add. I would just say that for those who feel like either this is just more of the same, or who don't really care about the legal principles, I want to put out there that um, if the president is asserting the right to summarily execute people for mere crimes, under a theory that they are transporting drugs and that that itself is an armed attack against the United States, then there is no real limiting principle there. And what I mean by that is if he's asserting the right to kill them at sea, he's asserting the right to kill them inside the United States. And so just think about that, right? Think about all the people that this administration has claimed are terrorists. They've claimed that their political opponents are Antifa. They've claimed that George Soros is Antifa. They've claimed that federal judges are materially supporting these Antifa at times. And so while I'm not suggesting that politically this is going to happen anytime soon, I think we should all care about whether we know precisely what are the parameters in which the president can use force against any of us, and whether that's clearly defined by law or merely defined by his will.
So, to be clear, you see what's happening with these strikes on alleged drug boats as being the first step toward using force against Americans in the United States.
I don't know, but I think it should be terrifying to all of us that I don't know.
Hmm.
Do you know?
Oh,
I mean,
I'm
what's the
fortunate to
legal
just ask
yeah.
the questions.
What's
Yeah.
the legal limiting principle? That's what I would ask, that's what I would ask everyone. What is the legal limiting principle?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, we have missed a very spirited conversation here as we have talked. Apologies for anybody who had good questions or comments that we couldn't incorporate into this. I'm sure a lot more people will be watching this. Where can people see more of your work, Rebecca?
So I'm a professor of law at Cardozo Law School. I write often for Just Security, for which I'm also on the board, and I'm on Blue Sky.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for joining. To everybody who's been watching this video, appreciate you being a part of it with us. Your subscription to my Substack means a lot. People who become paid subscribers allow me to keep doing this work. I can't do it without my paid subscribers. So, special thanks to you. We'll be back again soon. Rebecca, really interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me on.